I never thought I'd be writing this down, but I need to process what happened at my daughter Emily's 13th birthday party last month. The events of that night have been keeping me awake, replaying in my mind like a twisted movie I can't turn off. It started when Emily begged me to host her party at that old warehouse downtown, the one that used to be some kind of event space before it went out of business. The space was cheaper than I expected, which should have been my first red flag. The owner, Mr. Davidson, was eager to rent it out, too eager, looking back. He was a tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes who kept assuring me the building was perfectly safe for children, despite its deteriorating appearance. I remember how his keys jangled eerily as he showed me around, the sound echoing through the vast empty space. Emily wanted a traditional sleepover party with just 5 of her closest friends. I spent the afternoon decorating, trying to make the cold industrial space feel festive. The balloons seemed to drift oddly in the still air, their shadows stretching across the concrete floor like reaching fingers. The echo of the tape gun as I hung streamers made me jump more than once. Still, I told myself I was being silly. It was just an empty building. The girls arrived just before sunset. Their excited chatter bounced off the walls, temporarily masking the building's inherent emptiness. We had pizza, chips, and a beautiful cake I'd ordered from Emily's favorite bakery. Everything seemed normal at first. The girls were taking selfies, giggling, and dancing to music from our portable speaker. I remember checking my phone. It was 7:43 p.m. when things started to feel wrong. I was in the makeshift kitchen area, rinsing paper plates just to keep busy. When I first heard it, a metallic scraping sound from somewhere deep in the building. I assumed it was the old heating system kicking in, though looking back, I don't think the heating even worked. The sound came and went, like someone dragging something heavy across a metal floor. The girls were too busy with their TikTok dances to notice. Around 8:30 p.m., Sophie, one of Emily's friends, said she needed to use the bathroom. I directed her to the restroom down the hall, watching as she disappeared into the darkness with her phone's flashlight leading the way. 10 minutes passed, and she hadn't returned. Emily went to check on her, and that's when we heard the scream. I ran toward the sound, heart pounding. The bathroom door was locked. Sophie was crying inside, saying something about seeing a man's reflection in the mirror. When we finally got the door open, the bathroom was empty, except for Sophie, but the mirror was shattered, its pieces scattered across the wet floor. Sophie swore she hadn't touched it, that it had exploded on its own while she was washing her hands. I called Mr. Davidson immediately. He arrived 20 minutes later, out of breath and sweating despite the cold. He checked the security cameras in his office, but they showed nothing but static. He claimed it was an electrical issue, but I noticed how his hands trembled as he rewound the footage. That's when he told me about the previous incidents. 3 years ago, before the building closed as an event space, another birthday party had ended abruptly when 2 children reported seeing a man watching them from the shadows. The police found nothing, but 6 months later, a wedding reception was canceled mid-event when guests complained of strange noises and missing personal items. The business shut down shortly after, but Mr. Davidson had kept ownership, desperate to recoup his investment. I wanted to end the party right then, but the girls begged to stay. They were scared but excited, treating it like an adventure. I agreed to continue, but only if we all stayed together in the main space. We tried to return to normal, playing games and taking photos, but the atmosphere had changed. Every sound made us jump, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. At 9:45 p.m., our phones stopped working. Not just 1 or 2, all of them. They showed full batteries but wouldn't connect to any network. Even Mr. Davidson's landline in the office was dead. He suggested it was routine maintenance by the phone company, but his voice cracked as he said it. I knew we should leave, but when we tried the main entrance, the doors wouldn't budge. The doors were chained from the outside. Mr. Davidson swore he hadn't done it, that it wasn't possible. We tried the emergency exits, all locked. The windows were too high and reinforced with metal bars. We were trapped inside the warehouse, and the scraping sounds were getting louder, closer. That's when we heard it, movement in the ventilation system above us. Something was crawling through the ducts, making its way toward our location. The girls huddled together on the floor as I tried to calm them, but I was terrified myself. Mr. Davidson had gone pale, muttering something about them coming back. We found ourselves in the maintenance room, searching for anything we could use as a weapon. That's where Mr. Davidson finally broke down and told us the truth. The warehouse had once been used by a criminal organization to store stolen goods. Years ago, during a police raid, several members had disappeared within the building, their bodies never found. The scraping sounds we heard? He believed they were still hiding in the walls, living in the forgotten spaces between floors. The police arrived at 11:23 p.m., responding to a silent alarm that had been triggered in the building's old security system. They found us huddled in the maintenance room, the girls traumatized but physically unharmed. The chains on the doors had vanished. During their search, they discovered a network of hidden rooms and passages within the walls, and evidence of recent habitation. In the days that followed, the police investigation revealed the terrible truth. A homeless man had been living in the building's hidden spaces for months, surviving on stolen food and watching the occasional events Mr. Davidson hosted. They found his nest, a small room filled with photographs he'd taken of unsuspecting people, including pictures of Emily and her friends from earlier that very night. The warehouse was condemned and sold for demolition. Mr. Davidson was arrested for criminal negligence. He had known about the break-ins but kept renting the space anyway, desperate for income. The man who had been living in the walls was never found, but the police believe he fled during their raid, escaping through the same hidden passages he had used to terrorize us. Emily still has nightmares about that night. The other parents were furious with me, and I don't blame them. I think about how differently things could have turned out, how vulnerable we all were in that vast, empty space. The girls don't take photos anymore. They say they're afraid of what might show up in the background. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if he's still out there, finding new walls to hide behind, watching other unsuspecting families through the cracks. I've learned since then that the cheapest option isn't always the safest, that some buildings hold darker secrets than others, and that sometimes the monsters hiding in the shadows are all too real. Emily's 14th birthday is approaching, and this year we're celebrating at home, with all the lights on, doors locked, and security system armed. Some risks aren't worth taking twice. The grass in our backyard had grown too tall. I noticed it that morning while setting up for Tommy's 10th birthday party, but there wasn't time to mow it. Looking back, I wish I had postponed everything until the yard work was done. Maybe then I would have found the hidden cameras before the children arrived. Maybe then things would have turned out differently. Tommy had begged for a gaming party. I transformed our finished basement into the ultimate gaming den, with 4 large TVs, multiple consoles, and comfortable seating for all 8 of his friends. The boys would play multiplayer games, enjoy pizza and snacks, then camp out in sleeping bags. It seemed like the perfect plan for a group of tech-savvy 10-year-olds. The party started at 4 p.m. Parents dropped off their excited kids, each clutching their favorite games and controllers. The basement filled with the sounds of button mashing and victory cheers. I brought down pizza and drinks, watching them compete in racing games and fighting tournaments. Everything was normal until I checked our home's Wi-Fi settings. Our network was showing twice as many connected devices as there should have been. I assumed it was a glitch at first. Maybe some devices were counting twice. But when I looked closer at the list of connections, I saw unfamiliar device names. Names like Camera 1, Camera 2, and Camera 3. My stomach dropped as I realized what that meant. The first camera I found was hidden in the basement's air vent, its tiny lens barely visible through the slats. It was sophisticated equipment, not some cheap surveillance camera you'd buy at a hardware store. The second one was tucked behind the TV, blending in with the black cables. The third was worse. It was inside Tommy's new gaming headset, the one I didn't remember buying. I didn't alert the children. Instead, I called the police while pretending to order more pizza. The dispatcher understood immediately when I spelled out cameras instead of giving my toppings preference. She told me to act normal and keep the children in the basement while officers were en route. But then our internet went down. The games froze. The Wi-Fi was dead. Even our cell phones couldn't connect to their networks. The boys groaned in disappointment, but I felt pure terror. Someone had cut our connections to the outside world. Through the basement window, I saw movement in our backyard, a shadow passing through the overgrown grass. I told the boys we were going to play a new game called Silent Fort. They had to be absolutely quiet while building a fort under the basement stairs. They thought it was exciting, a new challenge in their gaming marathon. I turned off most lights, claiming it was part of the game. In reality, I was trying to make it harder for anyone to see us through the windows. Huddled in the fort with 9 children, I strained to hear any sounds from upstairs. The basement door was locked, but I knew that wouldn't stop someone determined to get in. I could hear footsteps above us now, multiple sets. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew we were trapped. The basement door handle started to turn. I covered Tommy's mouth before he could scream. The other boys froze, finally understanding this wasn't a game. The door was solid oak, an original feature of our century-old house. But the lock was new, installed just last week by a locksmith who had insisted on doing the work late in the evening. Later, the police would tell me that the locksmith wasn't a locksmith at all. He was part of a sophisticated criminal ring that targeted children's parties. They would scout locations, install cameras, then wait for the perfect moment to strike. The cameras had been streaming everything to a vehicle parked nearby, watching us, learning our vulnerabilities. The SWAT team arrived before the intruders could breach the basement door. They had been monitoring this group for months, following a string of similar incidents across 3 states. 4 men were arrested in our backyard. 2 more were caught in a van filled with surveillance equipment, hard drives, and detailed files on dozens of families. The investigation revealed the horrifying scope of their operation. They had been posing as various service providers, locksmiths, internet installers, gaming equipment sellers, to gain access to homes. They specifically targeted gaming parties because the equipment could easily hide cameras and recording devices. The headset in our house had been secretly delivered to our porch the day before, made to look like a late-arriving birthday present. We've since moved to a new house in a different neighborhood. Our security system is state-of-the-art, and I personally inspect every piece of electronic equipment that enters our home. Tommy doesn't play online games anymore. The thought of connecting with strangers through the internet terrifies him now. His friends still come over, but they play board games and card games instead. The gaming equipment from that night was all seized as evidence. Sometimes I think about those cameras, silently watching us for hours, transmitting our every move to criminals who saw our children as targets. I think about how many other families might still be under surveillance, unaware of the predators lurking behind their screens. Tommy is in therapy now. Most of the other boys are too. They're working through their trauma, learning to trust technology again. The therapist says they're resilient, that they'll recover. But I see how Tommy checks for cameras everywhere we go. I watch him cover his laptop camera with tape and unplug every device before bed. The hardest part isn't the guilt, though I feel that too. It's knowing that somewhere out there, more predators are adapting, finding new ways to exploit our digital vulnerabilities. Every time I see a child's birthday party being planned in our neighborhood Facebook group, I want to warn them. Check your Wi-Fi connections. Monitor your network activity. Look closely at every gift that arrives unexpectedly. And maybe, just maybe, consider a party without screens. As a professional party planner for Silicon Valley's elite, I've organized hundreds of events in the most expensive homes imaginable. But Stella Chen's Sweet 16 at the Morrison Estate would be my last. What happened that night changed everything I thought I knew about my profession, my clients, and the dark secrets wealth can hide. The Morrison Mansion was a $40 million property that Mrs. Chen had rented for her daughter's party. I arrived early that morning with my team of caterers, decorators, and servers. The professional kitchen was already stocked with premium ingredients for the 9-course dinner. Everything seemed perfect, except for the strange tension among the household staff. The head of security, Mr. Reynolds, insisted on briefing me personally about the mansion's layout. He seemed unusually concerned about the guest list and kept emphasizing the importance of checking every attendee's invitation. I assumed it was standard protocol for such a high-profile event, but his hands shook as he showed me the security camera feeds. The theme was Modern Marie Antoinette, all gold and crystal and champagne bubbles. We transformed the grand ballroom into a contemporary Versailles, complete with ice sculptures and a champagne tower. The budget was virtually unlimited. Mrs. Chen had only one rule: no photographs allowed during the party, not even from the professional photographer I'd hired. Guests began arriving at 6, just as a storm rolled in. 50 teenagers from the most powerful families in tech, dressed in designer clothes and dripping in jewelry. The adults arrived separately for their own reception in the East Wing. I noticed Mr. Reynolds scanning each invitation with a UV light, communicating constantly through his earpiece. The first sign of trouble came during dinner. One of my servers reported that several guests had gotten sick after the first course. Then more started feeling ill. The symptoms were strange: dizziness, confusion, but not exactly like food poisoning. I checked the kitchen, but everything was prepared according to standard protocols. In the downstairs bathroom, I found a young girl trying to help her friend who had collapsed. A broken pearl necklace lay scattered across the marble floor. But something wasn't right about the pearls. They were too uniform, too synthetic. When I picked one up, I noticed a tiny seam running along its circumference. The pearls were capsules, cleverly disguised as jewelry. Inside each one was a powder that lab tests would later identify as a sophisticated combination of drugs. Someone had distributed them among the guests, not just as party favors, but as a test run for something much bigger. Mrs. Chen wasn't really Mrs. Chen. The real Mrs. Chen and her daughter were out of the country. The woman who hired me was part of an organization that specialized in testing new designer drugs on wealthy teenagers. They used elaborate parties as cover for their experiments, gathering data on the effects of their latest formulations. By 9 o'clock, ambulances were arriving. 17 teenagers were hospitalized. The fake Mrs. Chen had vanished, along with several members of the security team who turned out to be her accomplices. Mr. Reynolds was found unconscious in the security room. He had tried to alert authorities when he discovered the truth, but they got to him first. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar incidents across different cities. The organization targeted communities where wealth and status would discourage victims from coming forward. They used legitimate businesses, like my party planning service, as unwitting covers for their operations. The necklaces were just one of their methods. They had also developed fake breath mints, hair accessories, and even temporary tattoos laced with their compounds. My business was investigated for months. Though I was cleared of any involvement, my reputation was ruined. During the investigation, I learned that 3 of my previous events had also been infiltrated by the organization. They had been perfecting their technique, testing different delivery methods and combinations of substances. The victims' families formed a support group. I attend their meetings sometimes, listening to teenagers describe their ongoing trauma, their fear of social gatherings, their inability to trust. Some still have unexplained health issues. Others struggle with nightmares about that night, about the strangers who used their privilege against them. I work at a small coffee shop now. Sometimes parents ask me to help plan their children's parties, having no idea who I am. I always refuse. I can't risk being involved in another celebration, can't bear the possibility of more young lives being damaged. The organization was never fully dismantled. Only a few lower-level members were caught. Every few months, I hear about another suspicious party in another wealthy enclave, another group of teenagers experiencing unexplained symptoms, another investigation that goes nowhere because the victims are too embarrassed or afraid to speak out. I keep a file of news clippings looking for patterns, trying to warn people without seeming paranoid. The hardest part is knowing that somewhere out there, Mrs. Chen is probably planning another party, another test run, Another group of innocent teenagers who think they're just celebrating a birthday. In my nightmares, I still see those fake pearls rolling across the bathroom floor, their secrets spilling out too late to save anyone.